guys are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast, and I'm here with my friend Zach Ellis. Zach is co-founder of Mosaic Counseling Center and associate director of the Nathan Project. His work centers on helping people find freedom from sexual brokenness and equipping the church to become a safe and redemptive place for healing. Through individual therapy and recovery groups across New England, Zach walks alongside men and their loved ones as they pursue restoration and wholeness. He's originally from the Northwoods of Wisconsin, but Zach now lives in Somerville, Massachusetts with his adventure buddy and wife, Kate, and their wonder dog, Nori. That's quite the claim about your dog, Zach. In his free time, Zach enjoys wandering both streets and wildernesses with a camera in hand, captivated by the world's muchness. Zach, thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Rebecca.
You and I met, I think, maybe a year or so ago through our local church, and it's been fun just in little snippets of conversation along the way, getting a little bit more of a sense of what you do for your day job. In advance of our conversation today, you, like some of my other guests, asked, is there a plan? Like, do you have questions I can look at? Should we coordinate on what the plan is? And the answer is no, there's never a plan. I just sort of jump in and we see what happens. But it made me curious, Zach. I don't know if you're like a personality test kind of guy.
I guess.
Tell us where you place on the various personality tests, or your favorite one.
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's too many to choose from, and I think I've probably done all of them along the way. If I recall correctly, I would be an ENFJ, high on the extroverted side of things. For an Enneagram, I'm a 7 with sort of jokingly a 7 wing. So like
all the fun all the time.
That's right. Always planning out the next project, the next adventure. Yeah, those are the top 2 that come to mind.
Oh, that's funny. Okay. So I'm in those terms an ENFP, hence why there wasn't a plan and why you would wish that there was a plan. That's sort of a P versus J thing for those who are not familiar. P's kind of go with the flow in all senses, and J's like to have a plan and they like to follow the plan. So I probably made you uncomfortable. And yeah, the Enneagram is sort of this weird thing which, is utterly unscientific, but often quite insightful, I think, in terms of how it's been helpful to me. I'm an Enneagram 2 for anyone who's curious, which is the helper, which sort of sounds lame until you dig more into it and realize, oh, actually helping people is something that we are called to as Christians. So I enjoy that role in at least some people's lives. Zach, tell us, so it's sort of curious then, as somebody who enjoys a lot of fun, why you have chosen to give your kind of professional life to having conversations, which I'm assuming a lot of the time aren't particularly fun, with people who are struggling in various ways with sexual brokenness. So tell us how you came to be doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you're right. The word fun sort of needs to be nuanced in this work. I do often find myself talking with clients and feeling the sort of joy that comes from conversations that are layered with honesty, with vulnerability, with curiosity. And there very much is this element of adventure, this element of fun that maybe we have to kind of pad a little bit to say, well, I'm having fun in some ways. And also I recognize that this is heavy work. Oftentimes this is difficult work to be making sense of our story, especially when so many of our stories, if not all, at some level are impacted by the effects of brokenness in the world, trauma, we could say. And that is much of the focus that I take in my work. So it's an odd kind of fun and it really is in so many ways fun. I think probably when put in the perspective or the context that this is work that leads towards healing and wholeness, even when it is dark and overwhelming, that is our trajectory. And I think that's why I enjoy it so much.
Yeah, that's interesting. There are so many things I want to ask you, but first, I want to ask you questions coming from 2 different angles, 2 almost opposing angles about the kind of work that you're doing. Because I think there'll be some who listening to us and think, okay, so you work with people who are struggling in some way or other with their sexuality. So my guess is, coming from a Christian perspective, that you are with people, alongside people, recognizing that not only maybe bad things have happened to them, as in they've experienced what Christians would describe as sort of the sin of others impacting them, but that also in many cases they would have responded in sinful ways. And in fact, from a Christian perspective, we're all like, pretty much everything we do is one way or another actually tainted by sin, even when we're doing good things. A sort of famous verse in the Old Testament that is, our good deeds are like dirty rags. Like there's a sort of element of sin, even when we're doing our kind of best. Mm-hmm. And I think there'll be some of our listeners, perhaps not coming from a Christian perspective, who would say it's just really unhealthy and unhelpful to even think in terms of sin when it comes to sex. That actually the reason that people do bad things in the realm of sex is because they've been brought up to think that sex is somehow bad or sinful, or, that it's really that sort of sin diagnosis coming into the picture is the causing the problems in the first place. And I think there'd be others, and I'm going to ask you a long question, you can then take pieces of it. Others, maybe coming from a Christian perspective, who would say, you're using the language of brokenness here rather than sin as a sort of first pass. Aren't you sort of downplaying the reality that a lot of the people you're working with are in various ways going to be engaging in sin? So I'm asking you kind of questions from two almost opposing angles, but I'm curious for your first thoughts on that.
Yeah, I love it. A good layered, complex question. I think what comes to mind, Rebecca, as you bring these sort of different perspectives into the pictures, the vision that I get is really kind of this continuum. And on one side, we have the language of sin, and on the other side, maybe we have the language of trauma or brokenness as sort of a different shade of the same thing. I think oftentimes it's easy for us to get caught up in what feels like black and white, sort of polarized thinking, and instead, what I like to do and find to be so ultimately effective is to kind of crack that black and white open and to look at all the color that is in between those two, to really be able to see things on a continuum and to think of these things in maybe terms of shades that all point in a particular direction. Maybe to be a little bit more clear about that, I love this phrase, and I think it might come originally from this therapist, Jay Stringer, who wrote the book Unwanted. He uses this language to say that lust is both a sin and a sign. It is both an indication of our brokenness, of our failing, of our missing the mark, and at the same time is an opportunity to be curious towards the why underneath of the what. And I think sometimes if we live, say, too much leaning into the camp of sin, that can almost be like too low resolution of a picture. Like it gives us some of the story, but not all of it. And on the same side, if we sort of make less of or light of our brokenness, then we could fall into the trap of just normalizing behavior and just saying, well, there's actually no problem with this. And in both of those sort of two ends of the extreme, we miss out on all of that color and all that opportunity for curiosity in between. So this is the space where I hope to inhabit.
Yeah, that's helpful. Listeners to the podcast would have heard me say probably 100 times at this point, but I'm going to say it again because I'm like a broken record. That at the center of what the Bible has to say about marriage and sex being marriage being the only context for sex from a biblical perspective, at the sort of very center of that is this idea that marriage is in fact a signpost pointing to something else, that husband and wife in marriage are a living metaphor picturing Jesus's relationship with his people. And that the one flesh union that we see at the very beginning of the Bible, when the first man and first woman are sort of brought together, there's this kind of curious line, therefore a man will leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and they should become one flesh. In the New Testament, that is unpacked as always having referred to Jesus and his people and the union that we have with him, which is not, it's sort of, I think it's important to distinguish a little bit carefully. It's not only talking about sex, because marriage is sort of more than that, but it includes the reality and the capacity that we have for sexual union. That's actually pointing us to the greatest love in all the universe, which is Jesus's love for us. And so I like what you're saying there about even as we experience sexual desire in sinful ways, it's not because there is no kind of true and good and beautiful desire that lies behind this, because there is like that actually even our fundamental desire to be one with another person is pointing us to Jesus's desire to be one with us, expressed in his death on the cross in our place, and an invitation to live with him forever as united as a head and a body. So I love how you're sort of drawing on that sign piece. As we think about it, just for a little bit more about the relationship between trauma and how we might end up behaving sexually, and we can sort of unpack the different pieces of our moral responsibility for our behavior, even in light of things that have happened to us. But as we think about that kind of relationship and pipeline, what would you say to somebody who maybe is not a Christian listening to us, who has experienced sexual abuse or traumatic experiences that have really impacted them in this area in particular? What would you say to them about the hope that Jesus can offer to those of us who are in that situation?
Yeah. Boy, it is a big question. I think we necessarily have to start with the unique offering, the exclusively unique offering that the Christian story has to make, in that redemption is a part of our story in and through Jesus. Jesus being God who took on flesh to dwell among his people, to enter into the landscape of brokenness, and to, if we could say, mysteriously, paradoxically, magically, subverting the whole thing to put death itself to death. Trauma acts in so many ways as a little death. Even if we still remain alive, there are parts of us that experience the overwhelm, overwhelm is the right word, that we don't know how to process. And in a sense, a part of us splits off, is fractionated away from what would otherwise be the integrated whole. And so in a way, we experience many of these sort of small deaths, these separations from self, as we live in the broken landscape of this world, even while we're surrounded with goodness. There's both of those happening all the time. And I think for people who experience trauma, which I think applies to all of us in one way or another, we can do the work of exploring and understanding, becoming aware of those traumas that have occurred in our lives. But then the next question that necessarily kind of emerges is, well, what do I do about this? I can become aware of it, but now I want a path forward that could bring me, say, back into, and perhaps even into, a new experience of wholeness that I've never had before. It's my understanding and the way that I work with both individuals in therapy and with men in our group context through the Nathan Project, is that is the arc, that is the story that we inhabit, the one in which redemption of the very areas in which we were hurt the most is bound to happen if we allow ourselves to walk within community, to practice honesty and vulnerability in community, so that we might experience that healing. There's a whole lot of paradox in that. Like I don't think any of us can give sufficient language to what happens when our brokenness is transformed into a greater depth of wholeness. It's just amazing to see happen, and I see it happen over and over again.
Yeah, I was talking with somebody earlier today about the sort of intertwined nature of some of the bad news of Christianity with actually the best news possible, which is that on the one hand, there's a kind of a piece of the bad news of Christianity is that as I look at myself, and as I look even at the depths of my heart and the thoughts that go through my mind and the things that sort of seem to spring naturally out of me, rather than assuming that they are all by nature good and true and beautiful, and if there's anything I see in there that isn't, then it must be because of forces from outside of me. Maybe I was raised in the wrong way, or had the wrong cultural environment, or the wrong education, that it couldn't possibly be sort of actually bad things springing out of me. A piece of the bad news of Christianity is to say, actually, no, like our sinfulness, our rebellion against God kind of goes all the way down. This is something that Jesus is very straightforward about, I guess. You know, he says out of men's hearts spring all sorts of things, including sexual immorality, is sort of category that the New Testament has. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, that the one person who actually knows the very worst of you and me is the same person who loved us enough to want to die for us. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I feel like so much of life in human terms, we end up kind of trying to hide the least pleasant parts of us. You know, we want people to be in on and to see the pieces of us that look really good, and they're going to make them want to, you know, draw near to us. And we want to often kind of shield them from the pieces of us that really, if they knew the actual truth of what's happening in our hearts, whatever, they would sort of recoil. Mm-hmm. And in relationship with Jesus, actually, it's not that you kind of paper over the depth of your sin, or the reality that a lot of what comes out of my heart isn't true and good and beautiful at all, but that Jesus's forgiveness kind of goes all the way down. It's like, you know, I drink a drink and it goes into my body to an extent that I can't just then sort of pull it out. And, you know, Jesus's forgiveness, like, it goes right down into the depths of me. So there's no part of me that is sort of discarded. I'm completely mm-hmm. known and completely loved. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, Zach, I don't know who first, I heard this from somebody who I know heard it from somebody else, but some of the people you'll be working with have forms of kind of sexual addiction. And I remember vividly hearing somebody say, like, the opposite of addiction is connection. Mm-hmm. And I'd love for you to kind of reflect on that in this context in particular, ways that you would see that the opposing force, as it were, to sexual addiction is right forms of connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the question. Let me see if I can kind of bring all these pieces together. And we can, I think, weave that topic of trauma into this conversation as well. What I heard you just describing really is that visceral, permeating experience of shame, this sense that there is something inherently wrong with me, such that I turn away not only from myself, but from God and others, to live in a sort of isolated place in order to, at least seemingly, protect myself from what could be judgment, ostracization, othering from those in my life. And yet when we do that, when we turn away from self, God, and others in that posture of shame, we actually cut ourselves off from the source where healing can take place. I think it's Saint Teresa of Avila that says, "He has no hands but ours," meaning that God chooses to work in and through his people in the context of community to make himself known. Of course, he can choose to do that in all sorts of ways, but we know that one of the primary ways in which God makes himself known is in and through his people, through broken people like you and me. When we step into a space, and I'll use the example, like the groups that I run for in this case, men who are struggling with unwanted or problematic sexual behavior, really what's happening in that group, it could feel like a mystery from people on the outside of like, what sort of magic, what kind of odd things are happening here. And what I could maybe clear the air is to say, there is nothing happening in that space, in the context of that group, that doesn't or can't happen in regular everyday life, except that what we do there is turning up the volume on our honesty, our vulnerability in the context of a group that's willing and chooses to walk alongside of each other for the long haul. It's sort of like another example. If you or I went to a dinner party or having a conversation with somebody and they're just talking all about themselves and it's sort of awkward and this isn't going anywhere. This is one-sided. Well, I choose to dismiss myself to go to the bathroom with no intention of coming back. That person receives no feedback as to how they're being perceived or received in the world. They don't have the opportunity to kind of know themselves and to grow accordingly. Maybe for social norms that make sense, but in the context of a group, we're sort of breaking all sorts of social norms and categories by baring ourselves in this vulnerable way to sort of audition our story, our thoughts and understanding of ourselves amongst a group of others who are walking in a similar path, and then to receive feedback, not just generic feedback, but curiosity, a compassionate curiosity that assumes there is more to the story, there is more to be revealed about how we have ended up in this place. And so that really feels like connection. That feels like being known by others, being seen, soothed, safe, and secure, as trauma specialist Peter Levine would put it. That's maybe in more clinical terms, but to have those 4 S's, I think really is what we talk about when we say we desire to live in connection with ourselves, God, and others, to be seen, soothed, safe, and secure. And that can happen. And when that does, when a space is created for that, healing necessarily takes place.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. It's something I was talking with another friend just yesterday about that specific paradigm that she'd recently encountered. And one of the things we were reflecting on is how in the community of the local church, and that's usually best sort of broken down to some extent. You know, we have a little community group, and as part of what our church offers, you know, various households, as it were, open themselves up in different ways through the week, and a group of people regularly meets on a Tuesday or a Thursday or a Sunday or whenever it is, typically in somebody's home, and it's a regular group of people, and people come together to read the Bible together, to pray together, to eat together, to cry together, to share, you know, what's going on in their lives, and that those relationships sort of spill out over into the rest of the week as well as people walk alongside one another. And one of the big metaphors that the New Testament gives us, or a lot of the language that it gives us for the local church, is that it's a family. Mm. And as I'm hearing you talking about sort of people being seen, soothed, safe, and secure, what that conjures up to me immediately is sort of the idea of a mother with her kids, or a father with his children, like a kind of very familial, nurturing space. And it's one where, and you know, I've got 3 kids myself, so you know, one of my roles in my children's lives and in the lives of a larger group of people who show up to my house on Tuesdays and kind of get my mothering, whether they've asked for it or not, as it were, is both to offer love and connection and nurture and you know, a hug and a meal and a listening ear, and also a kind of word of correction or advice, or like, hey, I'm going to step into the sort of mother adjacent role here and tell you this is what I think you should do. You know, the sort of and in the context of the local church, we can be doing all of the things that you're describing there in this group that meets for a very kind of specific reason, that we can be really learning what's going on in each other's lives, what we're struggling with, where we're feeling defeated, where we're feeling alone, where we're wrestling with sin and just are caught in cycles we can't seem to get out of, and that we can be with one another in that, not to affirm one another in our sin. I mean, that's actually the last thing I need from my Christian friends, is for them to see my sinful patterns and say, great job, carry on. Like, that's not what I need. I need them to say, I love you, I'm here with you, and I'm going to pray with you, and I'm going to help, like, let's figure out how I can help you dig out of this or grow in this area. Mm-hmm. And that both of those things, I like your framework of kind of the feedback at the dinner table. If you just leave and aren't willing to walk alongside somebody, how are they going to know? Like, how are we going to be able to help one another? That's
right. And help can look, you know, it can look, it can come in many different forms. And the primary, I think, one that I see being of such great, deep, lasting benefit is when we can inhabit that posture of compassionate curiosity towards ourselves and towards others. Really, I love this quote that comes from author Kent Dunnington. He wrote the book Addiction and Virtue. And he's kind of untangling these concepts, very Augustinian concepts of disordered desire, which sort of begs the question, or at least it leads in the direction of saying that it's not our desire per se that is bad or that is wrong or that is, but it's rather that our desires so often fall short of what is ultimate. Dunnington says that, like the prophets of old, today's addicts may remind us that our desire for God is trivial and weak, and our horizons of hope and expectancy are limited and mundane. I love how he speaks to this. It's like an invitation into more of the life that we do desire after. It's this elevation of the goodness of desire, even the goodness of arousal, to say, this acts as a sign, not just to not just to the abstract notion of God and this sort of longing for heaven to come, but for the life that he has given us to live now as we inhabit this posture of tension as sojourners, that biblical language for those of us who are wandering while at home, or who anticipate the yet to come while it has already begun. And I think that is so often the case for people who are struggling with problematic or unwanted behavior. It is that so often their desires, their good desires, have found a resting place in something that doesn't tell the whole story, that doesn't offer that depth of fulfillment that our hearts always crave towards. And so oftentimes, even when I'm working, say, with a client or with men in a group, they'll be saying, well, yes, I went to porn again this week, and I fell in that way. I struggled in that way. And they'll want to turn away from that and just kind of, let me just get back on the horse and keep moving. We'll just kind of soldier on. And instead, what I necessarily say and ask is, what more is there in this for us if we can slow down and pay attention to what's there? What good things are being pursued in illegitimate or not good ways? That opens the door to be curious about, but what is more to be revealed in our story? I think beyond that, uniquely in our culture today, I know this might come across as something of a kind of a crass phrase, but in the landscape of, say, the digital age where everybody has a smartphone in their pocket, we're talking about a very different kind of life that people are attempting to make sense of. And in particular, young people, where what might have been a more rare occurrence to say, stumble across a magazine or a video of some kind is now a near inevitable occurrence. The stats play out now that roughly, I think it's 15% of 10-year-olds are exposed to porn for the first time at that age, nearly half by 15, and the majority by 17, with the average age of exposure at 12 years old. So now when that's happening, exposure to pornography acts as the trauma itself. For us to bear witness to explicit video content in the way that is proliferated across the internet, it acts as a trauma of its own in that it overwhelms our senses. It spikes all of the neurochemistry way above normal, and our bodies don't know what to do with that. And so really, as we're talking with people today, especially young people, I think the assumption should be not if, but when did you encounter these things? How is it impacting your life? And how can we be curious towards what goods are being pursued that is otherwise being temporarily fulfilled in the seeking of pornography or habitual masturbation or promiscuity? So it's a long way of saying, like, curiosity is a requirement to step into this work and relationship with people who are struggling.
Yeah. And as a side note there, as a mother of 3 kids who are 15, 13, and 7, not only do my kids not have smartphones, because the amount of data showing that, I have 2 girls who were teenagers, and the correlation between smartphone use and depression and various other sort of negative mental health outcomes, especially among adolescent girls, is so strong that I absolutely don't want them to have smartphones. And then my son, who's 7, the data on both girls and boys encountering pornography, but I think on average there's more. It's more of a shift towards boys in that respect. Like he's not going to be getting a smartphone for that reason. And in fact, I've trained all my kids, they're not allowed to look at other people's phones either, because the chances of somebody on the school bus saying, "Hey, look at this," and it being something that none of us ever wanted them to see is just too high. So there's sort of 2 levels, 2 layers of kind of protection there to say the reality of the statistics you just quoted is so clear that those of us who are parents need to be taking some pretty radical steps to try and shield our kids from that kind of exposure that we wouldn't ever want them to have, but especially not at such an early age. And at the same time, recognizing how many people have been exposed to that at an early age, have become addicted before they even had any kind of tools or categories or inputs from wise adults to help them navigate and steer away. That there are a lot of young people in particular who are already kind of enmeshed in that before they've had any opportunity for help.
Yeah. And these dangers can kind of set us up for sort of a double bind in a way, to say, as we're so often prone to do, to kind of do the pendulum swing from one extreme to another. If we're paying attention to what's available now, as you just eloquently stated, what kids can be exposed to in a variety of ways, we could easily trend or tend towards the sort of then a hyper protective response. And that, even with good intentions, right? It's just a natural way we would lean. I want to limit exposure, limit opportunity. I want to kind of shore things up and make things safe if possible. And at the same time, I think that can come at the risk of making sex seem as if it is a dirty and dangerous and scary thing, such that we lose out on the goodness of sexuality as it's intended to be. So I see that happening all the time. Like I probably, the bulk majority of the men that I work with will come in and say, I never had a conversation with my parents about sex. And if we did, it was only about what I shouldn't do, what I should be afraid of, what I should avoid. And from that point forward, sex writ large was relegated to the shadow in their life as something, it's probably no one person that have said it in a, sort of darkly humorous quote to say that sex is dirty and dangerous. You should save it for the person that you love. That's often how it gets treated. And it precludes the opportunity to not only be curious towards the goodness of sexuality, the goodness of desire and arousal, because that doesn't go away. But then often it means that we end up doing that exploration. We end up pursuing knowledge and experience of sex in a hidden, secretive manner, because the only conversation that we've been offered was, this is dangerous, don't engage, just wait until that magical day of marriage, and then it'll all make sense. That doesn't work for anybody. So I think it's the both and. It's putting into practice measures of safety, and at the same time, and maybe even more so, having ongoing dialogue, to say not just one 100-minute conversation, but 100 one-minute conversations continually about the goodness of sexuality, our emotional life, our relational life, us being what we'd say biopsychosocial spiritual beings. Sex lives at the intersection of all of those domains. It's necessarily in and throughout all of our experience. And well, I think God was up to something when he designed us in that way. And so if it's a good thing, then I think we do have to be leaning more and more in the direction of those conversations as well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And one of the things that I've sort of tried to do with my kids from the ground up is talk to them about the meaning of marriage from a Christian perspective as Jesus and as people, and how with that kind of center in place, then to talk to them about all the things. And we have very kind of open conversations. A young friend was hanging out with us, me and my daughters, the other night. And she was kind of, she was like, wow, it wouldn't have occurred to me to ask my parents the questions your kids are asking you. And they're clearly very comfortable talking to you. I was like, well, I hope so, because I want my children to see me and my husband as the people they most trust to talk to about all of these things, rather than the last people they could ever feel comfortable talking to. I think it's kind of easy as parents to find yourself in that latter category. And if you're not initiating conversations and having an openness to conversations pretty early on. And I think, again, there are some Christian parents who would struggle with that and saying, actually, I don't want my younger children especially to have any kind of concept of sex until a certain age, because it can feel like it's just inappropriate for them to have any understanding. I think the reason I don't agree with that is because in order to read the Bible with your children, you're going to bump into sex quite regularly, in the Bible, like this, whether it's Mummy, what's a prostitute, or whether, it's what's sexual immorality, or what does this mean, or what does that mean? Like it's actually, you can't get through much of the Bible without having to have, at least at a basic level, a conversation with your kids that is about sex one way or another. And so I've sort of seen it more as an opportunity to say, okay, I'm going to put the gospel message of Jesus right at the center of this, that even at its best, the absolute best possible sexual or romantic relationship could only ever be a tiny echo of Jesus's love for us. Like this is, we're dealing with something so much greater that we can all access through relationship with Christ, and that we will only fully access when he comes again. Like there's this sort of sense from a Christian perspective of being in an in-between time of Jesus has come and has saved us, but that he also will come again, and he will make a new heavens and a new earth, and we'll have resurrection bodies that are free of sin and suffering and sadness and all the things, and that we will live together. And this is a really kind of interesting New Testament metaphor. All Christians together will be Jesus's bride. And it's sort of fascinating to me, that picture, because in order for the metaphor of Jesus and his church as what marriage is about to even make sense, we need also the metaphor of the oneness of God's people, that we are sort of one body together if we're in Christ. It's not that there's sort of Jesus has like a billion different brides who are the individual Christians. It's that we together as his people are his bride. And it just puts the whole conversation and the whole all our kind of disordered desires, as well as our better ordered ones, in the context of the much bigger thing that God is communicating to us through our bodies, through our capacities, through desire and love and fulfillment at its best, is actually pointing us to something even better.
I think the Apostle Paul was onto something probably more than even meets the eye at first pass, as he writes to the Corinthian church, and he talks about the sin of sexual immorality being unique in that it is a sin against our own body. And I wonder if, and far be it for me to layer on to the Apostle Paul what he wasn't intending to say, but I do wonder sometimes, is he saying in that verse that sexual immorality is both a sin against our own body, meaning mine or yours, but also against the corporate body, against the body of the church, of the community, because this has such profound impact, even if my sexual brokenness is taking place in the space of isolation. If I'm watching porn habitually and engaging in that way, that still doesn't mean that it's not impacting everyone around me. In fact, these are one of the sort of conversations that we have in group context through the Nathan Project and in my individual work, is coming into an understanding that this is not just about me, but this is about impact on everyone that I encounter, that I bring myself wherever I go. And so if you and I and everyone that we're bumping into is secretly struggling, then we bring that into the way that we interface, that we interact with each other all the time. There's no escaping the impacts of that. And maybe to invert it towards the hopeful side, when we are living in a space of sexual wholeness, then all the more do we present ourselves, do we show up in relationships as whole, as that much closer to the wholeness that God desires for us. For us to live, I think, in that space of sexual health, it necessitates that we become curious and we do the work in all these other domains of life, that bio, psycho, social, spiritual, all those domains are touched. And I think then we really do get into the realm of spiritual formation, nested inside of a community. A phrase that I find myself referring to all the time, and it's really the tagline for our work at Mosaic Counseling Center, is that I am not only interested in freedom from sexual brokenness, but also freedom for the abundant life that I believe God has in store for his beloved sons and daughters. I think it's the author and psychiatrist or psychologist Kurt Thompson who says that freedom for, which can feel like something of an abstract context, if we sort of embody that, if we bring that down to earth, that right now in this space today, in this world, freedom for looks like extending the borders of Eden out into the wilderness. When we do that, that is such a dramatically more compelling vision than just a focus on freedom from, on not doing things, on living life in the negative. Nobody wants to live in that space. It's a necessary season of recovery and restoration, but we don't stop there. Our freedom from always has to lead to a freedom for. And I think maybe that's what I get to call back to the beginning of our conversation. That's what's the most fun for me. That's what gets me so excited. That's my sevenness, my love of adventure, is seeing that unfold in someone's life. It's remarkable.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. As you were talking there, I was thinking about the way that Paul in the New Testament talks about sin as slavery, and people being enslaved to sin. And I think as we think about this particular area of sex and when it relates to pornography, I think there are a lot of people who feel that in a visceral way, that it's not, I mean, perhaps I'm naive. In my experience of talking with people, seldom do I hear people saying, oh, this is just, I'm living my absolute best life, spending, hours and hours a week looking at my phone or looking at, wherever I'm accessing these images, and like I only feel better afterwards. It's more kind of the opposite of that, of people feeling more lonely and more depressed and more like there's just this sense of I'm stuck in something, like an addiction to drugs, which on the one hand, the sort of the wrestling between craving the next hit and also hating the life that you're stuck in and sort of wanting an escape from that. And yeah, it's just it's interesting how even this language written 2,000 years ago is so kind of accurately describing how all of us in one way or another, but like in this particular domain, I think people are kind of experiencing that in a visceral way of the sort of sense of slavery.
Mm-hmm. We could say that when we engage in these things, that we are violating an internal witness. That if we say that the Holy Spirit's voice within us, or our conscious, the way that speaks, if we habitually return to the things that our knower knows at its core, there's something wrong about this. If we continue to go back to that place, we find ourselves violating that internal witness. And neurochemically, there's some fascinating research here that says that when we do that habitually, we override that experience, that internal witness. There's a protein in the brain that gets produced called delta phos B that actually overrides what was otherwise that experience of wrongness, this kind of pricking of our conscience, the Holy Spirit's voice. And eventually, to reference the scripture again, when we do so for a prolonged manner in time, our conscience can become seared, such that we no longer respond to the very thing that originally at the beginning we knew was very wrong. And there was something wrong about it, not just for ourselves, but our relationships with others. So there really is what would we say? There is a dangerous element to this. Like we're kind of playing with fire when we wander off the good path and when we choose to take our sexuality into our own hands. So that's that middle ground space that we occupy between sin and brokenness. More, generically speaking, that this is serious stuff and requires attending to within the safety of community.
Yeah. Zach, I always like to ask my guests how they became a Christian and or why they find Jesus to be the most compelling center for their lives today. So I'm asking you.
Wow, what a great question. Well, I grew up within a Christian household, and in many ways, I felt like I have always swam in the soup of Christianity. There were many times when I would sort of frustratingly say to my parents, I wish that I could just step out of this so that I could see it fresh from the outside looking in, because this is all that I know. Well, I eventually did sort of take that into my own hands as I lived into what we could say was my own sinfulness, my own brokenness, my own disordered desires, and wandered off the path for a significant chunk of time starting in my teens and into my 20s. And it was really during that time when the truths that were seeded in me about Jesus, about his goodness, about his grace, those truths that felt sort of rote and all too familiar in my youth, they became real to me when I reached my own brokenness, when I reached the end of myself, having given myself, say, the permission to form life in the way that I saw fit to place things into the image that I thought would be good, and it didn't work. And so I did get that opportunity to reapproach God, on my own 2 feet, seeing all of it fresh and new, and recognizing the life that God has to offer, that Jesus has offered, is the life that I have been seeking after all along. And so that has been and will always be the greatest decision that I ever made, and continues to unfold with so much color in between what life with Jesus inside community looks like for me today.
I love that, Zach. And to end on a Enneagram 7 note of joy and fun and exploration, I think, gosh, knowing that I'm living my life in relationship with the God of all the universe, who made the stars and the galaxies and the forests and the seas and every creature under heaven and every human being on the earth, and that he has a purpose and a plan for me that I don't know day to day what that's going to be. I mean, I certainly have some sort of contours of it, but I don't know what tomorrow brings, but I know who is bringing it, and I know who I can trust in that. There is an excitement and a fullness of that joyful exploration, even knowing that there for sure will be suffering in my life to come that I haven't even seen, and I don't know if it could be hit like a truck tomorrow, or it could be something that unfolds gradually over years. It's not to say that every part of the Christian life is all sort of fun and birthday cake, as it were, but that there's this sense of meaning and purpose and exploration and fellowship and connection and joy that comes even in the midst of suffering from walking alongside others in relationship with the Lord, that is so much better than we could devise in our own sort of supposed freedom. When we decide to become Lord of our own lives, we do a far worse job of it than when Jesus, who actually made us in the first place, is in his rightful place as Lord of our lives. Thank you so much for joining me, Zach. You guys have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast. You can find us on X or Instagram, or you can even subscribe to the YouTube channel, a recent thing. Between now and the next time I speak into your headphones, maybe reflect on some of what we've been talking about here, and whether the things that you see in your heart that you may be ashamed to tell somebody else about, those are the things that the God of all the universe sees, that Jesus himself sees. And if you are one of his followers, then actually you can take extraordinary comfort in knowing that you have nothing to hide, because the person who knows the worst of you loves you literally to death and back. And if you are not yet a follower of Jesus, maybe open yourself up to that God of all the universe, who is waiting for you with open arms, whose arms were in fact opened wide for you on the cross, ready to die to bring you into relationship with him, ready to forgive your sin as soon as you turn and trust in him. Receive that invitation this week and respond.